Hello, my name is Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm a lecturer in early childhood studies at Bath Spa University and an associate lecturer at the Open University. I'm a trustee for the Fatherhood Institute and also an independent writer and consultant for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be exploring representation in the early years, inspiring you with guidance on ways to be more inclusive in your practice. And I'm delighted to introduce Laura Henry-Allain MBE as today's guest. In this episode, we'll look at anti-racism in early year settings. Laura, I think it'll be really helpful if we can share and discuss some practical ways for educators to promote anti-racism in their settings. But first, perhaps we can understand what anti-racism is. So could you define that term for our listeners?
Yeah, I think it is a great question that you're asking, one that I get asked quite a lot on my travels. And I think it's about breaking down and having that understanding, firstly, what is racism? What does that look like and feel like? Because I think a lot of people think, especially in educational settings or with any workplace, that people hook on racism as if to say it's name calling, as if to say it's a real offensive term. But then there are other areas of racism that we have to look at in terms of being, excluded. That sort of, being excluded, being that level of bullying, that sophisticated bullying that one might say is more difficult to prove rather than the name calling. Because straight away, if you say an offensive term, that's it, that's racism. But we need to look at the other areas about how we look at that in practice. And equally too on the racism, which I mentioned in My Skin, Your Skin, that anti-blackness. And on my travels, when I'm doing a keynote, I do a keynote around literacy and books and diversity. And there is quite a well-known book that a lot of settings have. And it talks about feelings, and a lot of settings use it to discuss feelings. And when it shows the black monster, okay, the black monster is full of fear and negativity. And it was pointed out to me last year. And so when I share that now, I give that as an example of anti-blackness and how that fits into anti-racist practice. So within a setting, you can have all the resources, etc., but then some of your resources, including books, may have imagery and terminology that is anti-black. So we need to have a conversation about that. And if we think about being the anti-racism element within that, it is a doing word. So many educators and teachers can say, but I'm not racist. But yeah, maybe you're not racist. And I'm really pleased to hear that. But actually, what are you doing? How are you being a voice within that? So it is about the actions that you're doing to be anti-racist. And that's what, to me, is the difference to saying I'm not racist to being anti-racist. So I know many anti-racist educators and teachers, and I can see that by the work that they're doing, by the books that they have read in the last few years, the changes that they've made within practice, the audits that they've carried out, and where they've actually got rid of books and resources, and how they go on training, how they equally to, how that training is impacted into the environment. So again, it's an ongoing thing. It's not saying, okay, I've been on a 1 hour seminar to do with anti-racist practice. I've listened to Shaddai doing a keynote at a conference. Whoopity woo, I'm now anti-racist. No, that's just the beginning of your journey. Even myself, I'm learning every single day. And I feel it's a whole community. As an educator listening to this now, how are you working with your whole staff team? How are you working with your parents and wider community and stakeholders? And how are we working with children in an age stage and ability way. And it's not, for instance, saying, okay, then we're going to do Black History Month. That's it. We're going to do Lunar New Year. That's it. It's literally every single day in your practice, how you're making sure it is anti-racist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're saying there about, most listeners to this podcast would say themselves, I'm not racist, but it's that action. It's them. What are you actually doing in practice? And for many practitioners, I think it's that long-term change that they really struggle with. So they may have been to a podcast, they may have listened to a book, but it's embedding it into the setting, in the culture and values of the setting, that perhaps a lot of settings really struggle with in order to make that long-term change. What advice would you give to those practitioners who are really seeking to embed it in a deeper way within their settings, beyond the kind of tokenistic approaches that we often see?
I think the main thing is just that what they've done is acknowledging that they need to do something about it. And I think that is your starting point, that you've acknowledged. And there are many, I always say it's not a financial issue. It's a thinking, creative issue, because there's many free resources, colleagues. There's many free resources that you don't have to spend a penny to. It's all online. There's podcasts like this one, other podcasts. There's, journals, there's papers, there's different websites, different community groups on social media. So many different. I co-wrote a guide, I believe about 2 years ago, how to be an anti-racist early years educator. That's a free download. And in that, there's some books that you can read. And when I'm talking about books, equally too, I think about books for children and books for educators, because automatically people always say, well, what books can we get for our setting? And they're thinking for the children. But I'm thinking, well, what about your reading? So one of the books that I promote now, I always have a book of the month when I'm doing a presentation. So there's always one for children and one for adults. And a recent one is Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, their book, What Happened to You? Yeah. And they, in that, just in brief for the listeners, if any listeners aren't aware of that particular book, it came out within lockdown. And again, because I'm dyslexic, I listen to books on audio. And when I get halfway through the first chapter, and I think, right, this book is super interesting, I have to order the book. And as you can see, I've got loads of post-its because I just loved it. And I was introduced to Dr. Bruce Perry by my colleague and friend Jane Evans many years ago, because his work on trauma and his starting point is, for example, you've worked with children and a child throws a chair or bites you, or a parent screams and shouts in your face, rather than saying, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? It's about reframing that to what happened to you. And they have a chapter in this on racism, which is really good. And a quote from that, if I have to look up, because I made a note of it, truly trauma-informed system is an anti-racist system. A truly trauma-informed system is an anti-racist system. Yeah. And what I like about that, and when I expand on that, is every single area of your practice, you cannot do special educational needs without looking at racism and anti-racism. You cannot look at outdoor learning without looking at race and anti-racism. You cannot do a working in partnership with parent schools. So as a point there, as a call to action for our listeners, is that any training that you go on, professional development, everything within your setting and school should have anti-racism within it. Because how can you cannot talk about anything within early years. And that's why I say, actually, we're doing the EYFS, which I know is problematic, which is another podcast for another day. There are elements in that you cannot do the EYFS holistically without looking at anti-racism practice. And when settings say, there's this thing about we only follow the children's interest, You can't just follow the children's interest, because how are you meant to support children to be anti-racist, to inform them of injustice, if you're just following their interests, especially if your setting or school is in an area that's not diverse. You have to include the provocations and the invitations around racism and having those open-ended conversations with children. What would happen if? What do we do here in Jumping Jack's nursery and in Happy Valley School? You know, I just feel it's a holistic way. And I have a phrase, if I do training around observation, assessment and planning, Sainsbury's, the store, there are other supermarkets out there. They have a saying, their old strapline heading used to be "Try something new today." So I always say, from that point of view, when we are starting, what is new today, especially within anti-racist practice? It could be a book. It could be a word that you're introducing. And that's a gentle reminder for educators and teachers in their practice. What's new today? Follow children's interests, just not to get it twisted. That's okay to follow children's interests. I advocate for that. But we still need to introduce to them other themes and concepts, especially within that anti-racism umbrella.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will link to those books and resources that you're sharing. So thank you for those. I think what you say there about anti-racism being fundamental and foundational to all aspects of the early years is also a really important point for listeners to reflect upon. But also what you say about following the child's interests, which can often be used as an excuse to say that, we're just following what the child does. But actually without that invitation, without that explicit discussion about difference, children can learn particular stereotypes from all aspects of life, really. And we as educators have that active role and responsibility to play in inviting children to learn about difference in a positive way. Of course, one way they can do that is through books and resources, as you mentioned. And that brings us on to My Skin, Your Skin. Now, this is a fantastic book. And again, we'll link that into the description for listeners. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how that book came to be, what it's about, how it should be used as well, and the reception to My Skin, Your Skin as well, how that's being received.
Thank you, Shaddai, for that, because it was a real, I really enjoyed writing My Skin, Your Skin, and how it came about was 3 years ago. So Ladybird, who are the publishers, who are just amazing, I worked with them on a guide for parents about reading with your children. And then one of the editors, Lou, came back to me and said, we really want you to write a children's book. So we were going backwards and forwards. And then I think at that time I had wrote or written, get the grammar correct, another free guide for parents, how to raise an anti-racist child with Mattel. It's downloadable for free. And then I said, maybe there's something in this that I could write a book then for children. And then, Lou and I, we came up with My Skin, Your Skin, thrashed it out. What would it, what I would include. And then including on the strapline, you can see on the title, I talk about empowerment, because that to me was super important, and not digressing to coming in where I talked about that professor from Belgium. I remember the point that he made is within our settings, for instance, when it's Lunar New Year, some settings have the red, the gold, they have some form of Oriental food and this and that and what have you. And he said, actually, that's quite disrespectful to do that. And we all sort of stood up because, when there's a festival, you have those displays in your setting. I was sort of thinking, oh my goodness me, this is really interesting what he's saying, this professor. And he was saying, actually, what you should be thinking about is empowerment. So by doing those displays, how are you empowering that community? And I was like, light bulb moment. And this was over 20 years ago. And so when settings say to me then now, are you saying then, Laura, we shouldn't do displays when we're looking at when we want to acknowledge a festival? And I'm saying yes, but your question to yourself should be, by doing this display, by having this quote unquote Caribbean carnival, by celebrating Diwali, Black History Month, the question should be, how are we empowering this community and these children and families? And I thought that is super. It's empowering in itself, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. So that's why I included it in the book, because it is about, yes, we must discuss racism, anti-racism, but it's about giving the voice of the child. How can we empower children to say that racism is wrong?
Yeah, it's a fantastic text, isn't it? And it's one that, as you mentioned, is useful for practitioners working in nursery settings, but also for parents and carers more generally who will be listening to this podcast today. And I think for parents and carers interested in anti-racism, this can be a really kind of accessible starting point for them to begin to have those conversations with parents, with their children about these sorts of issues. I know you've written a guide more generally for parents and carers to discuss anti-racism. Perhaps you could share a bit of insight around that and what they might want to do in those early years of life to support children to acknowledge difference from an early stage in a positive way.
I think equally it is true. And I think whenever we're having discussions about early childhood education, we must include the parents, because we can do everything within our settings, but then children go home to the grown-ups who they live with, okay? So I think for me, it is right in that guide, which is free. And one point in there that I remember writing was this thing when I have actually seen it myself, and it's about, again, this coming back to that term being anti-racist, being a doing word, and what parents may do subconsciously. Because children pick up things, the unspoken things, children pick up those behaviours. And so in that guide, what's in there is, I say, for instance, if you're walking down the street and a group of black men, young lads, a group of black young guys are coming towards you, do you cross the street with your children? Do you hold your children's hand tighter? So what messages are you giving to your child? You're not verbally saying, oh my goodness me, there's black young guys come in. Subconsciously, you're holding your children's hand tighter, and your child is going to pick that up, that black men are a danger. So you haven't said anything. And that to me was one of the profound things in that guide. And the colleague Emma and I, where we wrote that together, we give top tips for parents. And it's a starting point. Again, with families, it comes back to that, your values, conversations that you might have when you see an injustice. Do you not say anything about it, or do you actually say, well, that's not right? And again, it's for parents to show children that things aren't right. And children do pick up, as we know, I know I'm preaching to the converted. We know that children pick up all of their behaviours. And interesting enough, I heard a story once with a parent and her child. She took out her child with a group of children. It was her son, and there was 3 or 4. The boys were about 7, 8. They were having a pizza in probably a well-known brand, and in walked in a family, and one of the boys said something a racist comment about this family, and she was just about to put down her pizza to say something, and her son sort of like went, "That's racist, that is," and she didn't have to say any more. So that's what I mean about that empowerment. That, yes, that child wasn't within his early years, but I said, you must have been doing something within your home to actually, for your child to do that, to say that. You didn't have to do anything. So I said, well done you for that,
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic to hear. I think speaking out against injustice and empowerment have been such important themes throughout this episode. And they also link into the value of representation, really, which we'll cover more of in the next episode. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Laura.
You're welcome.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Laura, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Laura Henry-Allain MBE. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.